I'm coming to you a little bit earlier for next week's consideration because there are a number of factors that are on the table. That's probably the best way to put it. And, we have an eclipse, the lunar eclipse, which happens the end of next week. Jupiter moves into Aries. Also, as the week is getting near kind of its middle point, and then we begin the week with Mercury going retrograde. And while we have these retrogrades, 3, maybe a hint more than that times per year, there are factors, everybody talks about or considers or mulls over the moments when Mercury, how we think and how we communicate, goes into retrograde each of these cycles of the year. This particular one it's got a signature that I think it would be very relevant for us to contemplate or meditate upon. Generally, a retrograde cycle for Mercury lasts about 3 weeks. This one lasts just a little bit longer than that. Well, about 3 weeks, but I think maybe just a hint longer. But there's a factor that plays into an occasional Mercury retrograde that I think would be worth diving just a little bit more specifically into. When considering the trajectory that the slower planets facilitate, the consideration for them takes on the relevance of something that is going to be with us for a while, and thus is worth paying attention to, because the energy that is in that's transpiring is focused, more particularly on a narrow range or a narrow aspect of the astrological zodiac. Generally, a Mercury retrograde cycle will be the 3 weeks long, where it moves, generally about, say, on average, about 15 degrees, so half of a sign. Well, this particular Mercury retrograde brings things more to focus, because it's going to go retrograde at 4 degrees of Gemini, and Gemini is one of the signs that it rules. It's just recently gone into Gemini, and it's going to retrograde back to 26 degrees of Taurus. So basically we have about a 8-degree span that is going to be under scrutiny for how this particular Mercury retrograde is going to bring to focus for us the Mercury retrograde signature, which has to do with challenges to our ability to effectively articulate what it is that we would like to say. And also maybe the process of bringing our focused attention and concentration into a venue or a set of venues that we would like to enhance in some fashion. These are always a challenge when Mercury goes retrograde, because Mercury, after all, is our capacity to think and speak. Also, Mercury from the perspective of Gemini, the sign that the first sign that it comes into rulership for, is about markets, business cycle of markets. If you think back, you have to think back, maybe not so very far, but the marketplace was, a gathering on a street, in whatever country, city, where people bring their wares together, and there's a lot of comparison of, what you have versus what I have, and where can we find a common ground in that meeting place where we might be able to share each other's goods. That is the general idea of the kind of marketing experience that Gemini stands for. And Mercury, as the ruler of Gemini, generally is going to it's going to represent those conversations that transpire between the entrepreneurs in trying to hawk their wares to whoever and make a living and stuff like that. So because Mercury is going to be retrograde for all the way till June 2nd or 3rd, we've got a season where that whole venue that might surround any kind of the process of exchanging goods with one another might not be easily facilitated communication-wise with one another. I think that's a good way to describe it. And the fact that this starts at 4 degrees of Gemini and goes back to 26 degrees of Taurus, because Taurus is, amongst other things, it's what's the value of things? And so it would not be out of the question for the rest of May into early June that the process of coming up with a valuation experience that could leave the buyer and seller in a comfortable zone that a transaction has taken place that is amenable to both parties. Haggling, I think of in the process of living overseas in the Middle East as a young child or a youngster, and paying attention to the experience of going into the market and actually haggling for prices. Actually, I had an experience in Turkey, maybe about 12 years ago or so, of that exact same thing. The vendor wanted to sell me this, that, and the other thing. And basically, I wasn't interested in, purchasing an Oriental rug or all kinds of things, or a fine suit of clothes, expertly tailored. It was entertaining. I probably spent about a half an hour with the guy, and finally ended up buying a hassock, basically a footstool type thing for not very much money. But during this Mercury retrograde cycle, I think trying to find that point of equilibrium may be just a little bit more challenging, because the ideas of what something is worth to one person and the idea of what that same thing is worth to somebody else are not necessarily going to be, it will be a challenge to put an equal sign in between those two sides of that equation. And I think that's probably a good way to consider this particular Mercury retrograde that we're going to begin next week. Since this begins in the sign of Gemini, right off the bat, this particular Mercury retrograde speaks to us of, how effective are my thoughts and communication going to be? The general expression of a Mercury retrograde consideration that I always have at any Mercury retrograde process is that getting transferred from what it is that a person is thinking to actual language doesn't function overtly easily. And in the process of trying to share conversations with others, I've often used the example that during Mercury retrograde, if you're having a conversation with somebody and it doesn't seem like they're paying attention, it's highly likely that they're not. And the reason why is that when Mercury goes retrograde, there's a myopic process that transpired where, the thinking that's going on in a person's head is, it almost like it takes over. And so that in the conversational or shared conversational process, quite often, some little innuendo in the conversation of what is being said by one person gets, hooked onto by the person who's theoretically listening. And I say theoretically listening for a good reason, because what happens is that one little triggered thought, begins a subconscious or maybe partially conscious process where the scenarios of what that little thought triggered that sends one off into, where could that lead? Could this mean that? Could this mean that? Oh, is this better? Is this worse? And as those, the monkey mind takes over, you stop listening to the other person because something's been triggered in you that you're trying to determine and figure out. That's one of the beauties of Mercury retrograde. It stimulates those parts of us that generally we have some control over, but during a Mercury retrograde, not so much. And if you're having this conversation with somebody else and you really want to get your point across to them, and it seems like they're drifting, it's likely that is the fact. They are drifting, and you may just want to throw something errant into the conversation. The cockroach climbed up the wall, and you say that in the middle of what you're trying to say, just to see if their eyes open and say, what the hell's the cockroach doing in this conversation? Or, they may not even notice the cockroach is part of the conversation. If that's the case, please, and this is for any Mercury retrograde consideration, repeat yourself and do it as many times as is required until the other person is once again back in the present moment and not off on their monkey mind, triggered by who knows what and who knows where, when, why, or how. It's entertaining. It's always been entertaining knowing that this is one of the factors that Mercury retrograde brings into any equation, and to play with it. Oh, fun times. Mercury is the trickster, and the trickster gets excited when there are those opportunities to, play with life, the reality of energies that are, tickling the fancies of where those thought follicles are going to be inspired to follow or to lead. We have a choice in any conversation as to which of those scenarios we're going to tune into. Excuse me. So that's how the week starts. Mercury stations on Monday from its forward motion and goes retrograde on Tuesday, the 10th. Wednesday, 11th, middle of the week, Jupiter, which has been, working its way, a little bit more rapidly than usual through Pisces, is going to go into Aries. And Jupiter, as we all know, is that process of, in any scenario, Jupiter has this penchant to say, well, don't think small. Matter of fact, is there or are there ways to engage in whatever the process is in an effective enough way to say, how can we enhance this? Are there methods or considerations in this process whereby we can, add water to it and make it grow? And, I use that add water because it just came out of Pisces. Actually, it's just going to come out of Pisces next week. Into Aries. Aries is the impulse to be. That's an essential Aries. It doesn't necessarily have in striking out, it doesn't necessarily say it has a particular direction that it's going to go in. It's more along the lines that it just needs to go. It wants to do something. And Jupiter coming into Aries on Wednesday next week is going to inspire that enthusiasm to strike out, to do something, to go somewhere, to initiate something that hasn't been initiated before. And just remember, I have to keep in mind that we are at the very beginning of Mercury retrograde cycle. And part of, I'm going to keep bouncing into this Mercury retrograde cycle because it's so paramount in what it is that we need to keep in mind. One of the considerations of what Mercury retrograde can inspire within us is that if we have certain parameters or considerations that are paramount in venues that we need to accomplish, then before Mercury goes retrograde on basically Monday, Tuesday of next week, it's a wise thing to get your ducks in a row. If you happen to be, because Mercury retrograde, whether most people realize this or not, is an excellent time to investigate things. But in order to investigate things, the process has to be initiated prior to Mercury going retrograde, because if you want to, if you get an inspiration to investigate something after Mercury's already gone retrograde, good luck being able to find the appropriate material to be able to draw together in order to really dive in, particularly into whatever the nature of the investigation is about. However, if you already have an investigation underway, or there's a process that you have been contemplating and perhaps accomplishing to some extent prior to Mercury going retrograde, that is an excellent time to, think ahead, get, if there is or are resources that you might require in order to facilitate the appropriate continued investigation of whatever it is that is on your plate, that's the time to get as much of it lined up as you can. Because once Mercury goes retrograde, it's there's no guarantees. Actually, there is a guarantee. The guarantee is that if you wanted to run a race on a flat course around a circuit, it's highly likely that something, someone, or some process is going to put hurdles all the way around that course that you're running in order to make it just a little bit more exciting. Oh, is that more? Is that challenging? Well, of course it is. It's challenging, as any Mercury retrograde cycle will remind you. There are things that are going to pop up. And, yesterday, Mercury or the sun danced across, actually yesterday and today, danced with Uranus, the process of unexpected things showing up. And the sun is that vitality. What does it mean to be alive? And in the process of being alive, are you paying attention? Because there may be things that are going to tickle you in a rather abrupt fashion to say, what about this? Or what about that? And are you awake enough to be able to see those opportunities that show up that are, trying to distract you from where you think you need to be? Because oftentimes, even though we may have such a desire to accomplish certain things, there are meaningful reasons why distractions show up. Perhaps, there's only a perhaps, that thing that you were attempting to do, that place you were attempting to be, may not be the appropriate place for you. And the theoretical disruption that seems to want to distract you in some fashion from accomplishing whatever that goal you might have is there for a reason. I mean, I had an idea yesterday. I might go out and get another lawnmower because I've been thinking about it for quite a while. But, the weather got nice, which here in the Northwest, you basically, if the weather's nice, you want to do stuff that's outdoors. And I spent the entire day doing work related to the garden and the grounds around here and taking care of the things that I need to take care of in replanted forest that I have, the 80 acres up there. So, I didn't, by the time that 4 o'clock rolled around and I was just getting wrapped up with my very last of dirt moving, I was tired. And so let's just continue with our considerations for this next week. We have that Jupiter going into Aries. Opportunity will be knocking for us to consider, options that might expand the parameters of what it is that we would like to accomplish. But the Mercury retrograde puts in that cautionary tale that says, have patience. You may really be driven hard to say, this is something that I really need to do. And yet life has a most fascinating capacity to make sure that if you're paying attention to the process of really being alive, the essence of, full breath into what it is that is transpiring often will provide us with insight that short breaths often overlook. And when I'm, patience, I think patience may be one of the challenging venues to keep in mind as we begin this next week Mercury retrograde cycle and Jupiter going into Aries. Jupiter into Aries, the potential for impatience, amplification, up one side and down the other. The idea of striking out on that new venture and stuff. Hopefully by this week and before next week's start, if there is a new adventure that you have on your plate, hopefully you really investigated it as thoroughly as you can, because continuing with the investigation beginning next week it's going to be a little bit more dicey. The potential for disruptions are going to be more relevantly, or is that irrelevantly, on the plate. So we get to next weekend and we have our second eclipse. This is a lunar eclipse, and this is going to be across the Taurus Scorpio axis, with the moon being eclipsed in Scorpio. And it's like, this happens at 24 degrees of Scorpio. The sun will be at 24 degrees of Taurus. Saturn will be at 24 degrees of Aquarius. So we have a T-square going for this particular eclipse. The moon being in Scorpio. Scorpio is that zone of investigation. It is the investigator. Scorpio is the investigator, the detective, the sleuth, the shaman. So the process of this moon, this full moon, inspiring us to be very diligent in making sure that we are not overlooking any of the vital parts of any equation that we're participating in. Could it be a challenge because Mercury is retrograde? Oh, heck yes, it could. And I would actually count on it. So even though you may have come up with a sleuthing reality that has, determined that this is the reason why this is taking place, caution is advised, because it's highly likely that just, one, or is it a dozen aspects of the consideration may have been missed. So take your time, have a theory, and generally I would say, if you have a theory about whatever it is that you're investigating, you might want to share this with somebody else. That's a general way that you handle it. But because Mercury is retrograde, choose wisely in who it is that you decide to compare notes with. And like I say, if they don't see the cockroaches crawling up the wall, make sure that you choose someone else, or, rattle them really good so that they're awake and are paying attention to what it is that is on the table. If you got cockroaches on your table, yeah, it's a little bit more challenging. You probably left some food out. Saturn being in a T-square to this particular lunar eclipse, because the eclipses are all about change. That's the bottom line. There's a dynamism to them that says that, the whole process of what is on the table, and in this case, the Taurus Scorpio axis in the chart is about valuation, from the personal valuation of Taurus to the shared resource side of Scorpio. And so that matrix of trying to find a ground of commonality in between what it is that I own and we own as a together is what this eclipse is saying. Are you clear on this? Or might there be matters that need to be altered in some fashion so that perhaps some of those things which you may have that are dear and near to your heart as far as the ownership mechanism goes, could they be shared perhaps with someone else and enhance that Scorpio side of the equation that brings, it's interesting, it brings in more value if you can actually engage with somebody else to consider, what something is or isn't really worth. Now, the Saturn factor being in T-square to this up in Aquarius is saying it wants you to be specific in that type of a consideration, and being 90 degrees from both the sun and the moon says that and these are all in fixed signs, which so you can kind of from the fixed perspective see that opinions are more than likely there's an attempt to stick to one's opinions in the fixed signs because, I've lived this life experience for so long, and I've considered these matters for years, decades. Why would I want to change? And yet it's an eclipse. It is about change. And so Saturn at that middle point in Aquarius is saying, might there be, and we're talking about valuations here from an Aquarius perspective, might there be a way that we could take whatever we own, individually or in a shared context, and be able to utilize it in a way that might be of benefit to more people? Sort of a bug in your ear kind of a thing to hold this thought that as we go through this lunar eclipse next Sunday, what is the value of selfless and selfish in the parameters of ownership? Everything that exists on planet Earth came from Mother Earth. We have them for a season to utilize in hopefully as an effective a technique as possible. And the selfish side of the equation may not reflect that. Selfless, a bit more challenging. Remember, we're in Mercury retrograde season. The thoughts on this aren't necessarily going to just jump off of the table like that cockroach and say, I got the answer. Maybe. Or maybe the cockroach has decided to jump off the wall and climb over your shoulders. Pay attention. This is a good time for listening, probably more so than actually talking. And I am bringing you this consideration early this week so that you can be prepared quite specifically for what it is that, from a Mercury retrograde perspective, we are about to enter next week. So good luck, everybody. And as the stomach turns, as life unfolds, as the cockroach does what a cockroach does, I greet you and say, great salutations. Think clearly. Don't necessarily say it. And listen to what others have to say. And until the week after, when I will be back, ciao for now.